We've spent the last couple of years really trying to dig into the interplay between culture, the effectiveness, performance work that we do, and safety and risk, managing safety, managing risk in organizations, and try to understand from a culture perspective, what have we learned? It starts with management. Managers have to wear the same hard hats as employees. Managers set the tone for this on a cultural level through actions. Does my leader and manager actually care, truly care about my safety? That's the single most predictive item in a survey that we have from a diagnostic perspective that predicts safety and risk outcomes and how those are managed. Speak-up culture has really gained a lot of momentum and a lot of evidence base behind the importance of it. So what do you do to create that speak-up where people feel like they can challenge if they need to? You know, as you think about organizations in complex environments, dealing with ambiguity, working through the unknown, thinking about how you organize and how to reduce the functional boundaries that we create, the hierarchical boundaries that we create, all the stuff that's on the org chart that in a high-risk environment is clearly a part of the risk, and not even stopping on the internal boundaries, the internal-external. So, you know, thinking about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, you know, one of the things that's really fascinating about that is that of the 126 people that were on the deck of the Deepwater the day of the explosion, only 7 of those people were BP employees directly. The other 119 were contractors working, you know, BP working with about 8 contract agencies pretty closely to do what they were doing. So if you think that you don't have accountability, responsibility for coordinating across that internal-external boundary, you're deluding yourself. You do own that, and figuring out how to do that effectively in this context, critically important, critically important. The workplace is a really interesting kind of place to observe human behavior because one of the things we do is pretty much train the emotional response out of people. And in most workplaces, that's okay because fear doesn't really need to be something that you're closely attuned to. In high hazard, though, that's one of the most important signals that you've got to read the environment. And what's really interesting with this one is it really differs across industries quite a bit. And you can think petrochemical, you can think healthcare, you can think about space exploration, because the environment's really, really complicated to differentiate what is signal and what is noise. What do we need to be concerned by? So one of the things you figure out, particularly in that middle space, you know, thinking petrochem as an example, is that you're reliant on the dialogue that you create, on the habits that you create around talking about risk. Learn from the close calls. It's a pretty obvious point here that the stuff that almost kills you is something you might want to pause to learn quite a lot about to be able to prevent that going into the future. So that's not a shocker. Really difficult, though, for organizations to do that. How do they make that happen? They've got reporting systems for the things that do happen. We've got to comply on that level. So most organizations have that in place. Very few organizations have good systems in place for the stuff that almost got you. And it's difficult because people don't want to speak up about that stuff. And then the other part of this is that we just don't really pick up on all the things that are near risks. A lot of us in this room may have had close calls we're not really ever aware of. So how do you capture and get people to pay attention to the stuff that almost happens but didn't? It's very difficult, and there's got to be a clear effort there. Get to root causes, both in the context of the things that almost happen, the things that do happen. We're programmed to jump to the conclusion that involves, you know, maybe 2 of the balls on the table, but doesn't involve the whole situation. There's moving parts, a lot of people, very complicated. And the other part that's very difficult to see is the role of time. Things degrade over time. From the moment that the tool, that the machine is fabricated and comes off the conveyor belt, it's degrading. It's at its peak and it's now degrading. And we can't see that. People are notoriously bad at seeing changes that unfold slowly over a long period of time. And that's a real part of that programming, the look in the rearview mirror to understand the role of all these complex things. The last one, I'm particularly passionate about. This is kind of, what the profession is about, studying the way that the work actually, emphasize the actually, gets done on the ground. Not the way that management thinks it ought to be, not the way it's written in the employee handbook, the way it actually happens day to day in the workplace. The point is you've got to actually look really closely before you assume that the prescriptive version of what's supposed to happen is actually effective from the eyes of the people that are doing the work. And you've also got to understand the context that they're in. Today's talk, a little bit of a teaser as to some of the components of what we've learned really matters in this context. And those components are what drives the tools that we've created over this period of time that we're ready to launch with a benchmark at this point after having piloted them for the last year or so. Thank you.
Awesome.